Our first speaker was born and raised in Astoria, Queens. He's probably the only person on the planet to have appeared in both a martial arts flick with Billy Tabo Blanks and a radical event with Derrick Jensen. He's the author of 9 books, most recently Self-Defense for Radicals. He's a regular writer for Planet Green and can be found on the web at mickeyz.net. He's been an ethical vegan for 15 years. So welcome, Mickey Z.
Let me first say thank you for including me on this panel. I appreciate it. Thank you to my fellow panelists. Thank you to Michelle, of course, and to all of you for choosing to spend your Sunday afternoon with us. I know there are many, many choices here, and we really, really appreciate that you've chosen this panel. In an effort to have what happens here today, perhaps have some carryover afterwards, I like to appropriate a tactic that I learned during my 12 years in Catholic school. And when you go to Catholic school, you spend a lot of time in church, and there was one thing I learned that I still use today. So I'm going to ask each of you to turn to the person on either side of you, in front of you, behind you, etc. Shake hands, say hello, introduce yourself, exchange phone numbers. Maybe even say peace.
Hi. Nice to meet you. What's your name? Gail. Nice to meet you.
Hi, I'm Catherine. Hey, I'm Caitlin.
All right, that wasn't too bad, right? And as mentioned, we will pass around the hand sanitizer, this and stuff outside. And now that we're all on a first-name basis, I guess I should warn you that this panel has not been approved by the Department of Homeland Security, so you're all here at your own risk. This is the point where at least one of the speakers implores everyone in the audience to turn off their cell phones. But anybody who's seen me do an event like this knows I do quite the opposite, and it's particularly relevant for me to explain to you why, because it ties into what we're doing here today. I suggest you leave your cell phones on, because every time someone's phone rings, we can contemplate the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We would do that because one of the primary components of cell phone circuitry is a metallic ore called columbite tantalite, aka coltan, most of which is found in the African nation of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which just so happens to be embroiled in a particularly brutal civil war for more than 10 years. When I say particularly brutal, I mean even by today's insane standards. And both sides in this civil war are using child labor to mine and sell coltan to fund their military mayhem and feed our cell phone addictions. And it gets worse. The world's largest primate, the eastern lowland gorilla, has as its habitat the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in particular where the coltan is found. So I probably don't have to tell you what's being done to the world's largest primate in the name of using child labor to mine and sell coltan to fund a civil war and feed our addictions. But I could sum it up in one little factoid. In the past 5 years, the population of the eastern lowland gorilla has declined by 90%. So go ahead, leave your cell phones on. I guess we can only hope that some clever entrepreneur has recorded the cry of the eastern lowland gorilla, so long after it's extinct, we can use that cry as a ringtone. Khalil asked me to kick things off a bit here, and I guess in a way throw down the gauntlet, as it were. And to begin with, I'm going to offer a quote from the book or the movie Grapes of Wrath, as spoken by one of the lead characters, Tom Joad. And Tom says, maybe we're not all individual souls, but maybe we're all part of one big soul. Incredibly basic, I know, but within that simplicity lies what I believe to be the secret. For if we were to look upon all living things, including ourselves, as part of one collective soul, how could we not defend this soul by any means necessary? Now, what do I mean by collective soul? To understand this concept requires us to make connections which for the most part are not being made, in particularly on the left. In fact, most disturbingly on the left. Now I discussed some connections in the cell phone bit to begin with, but here's another idea of what I mean. Let's say a jaguar, a rapidly disappearing species. In Central or South America, its habitat long stolen by the progress of Homo sapiens, is starving. So it creeps onto one of the farms that's now on its former habitat, and it kills and eats a cow in order to survive. The reaction would be predictable. Human beings would be united in outrage. The jaguar would be called a pest. It would be promptly hunted down and killed without contemplation or penalty. After all, we can't let one of those beasts kill one of our beasts, can we? That's our job. And it's our job to tear down the rainforest so the cow had room to get fat in the first place. And it's our job to slaughter the cow, eat it, and get fat ourselves. And perhaps most importantly, it's our job to pretend we have nothing to do with this destructive cycle. In fact, pretend this culture doesn't even exist. Pretend we have nothing to do with the millions of animals tortured and murdered in laboratories each year, the millions of animals tortured and murdered for fur each year, the billions of animals tortured and murdered for food each year. Like all the issues here at the Left Forum, it comes down to perceptions. Our perceptions shape our reality. And my reality on this issue is that we need a far more holistic concept of radical activism, but unfortunately the connections I'm talking about are not being made, most disturbingly by those on the left. Now what do I mean by left? I'm going to cast a pretty broad net here, but to begin with I'm going to offer a little bit that Cornel West said a couple of years ago right here at the Left Forum when he was describing what it meant to be a leftist. Come on in. Everybody's welcome. All right, so a couple years ago, Cornel West said, quote, "If you are concerned about structural violence, if you're concerned about exploitation at the workplace, if you're concerned about institutionalized contempt against gay brothers and lesbian sisters, if you're concerned about organized hatred against peoples of color, if you're concerned about the subordination of women, that's not cheap PC chit-chat, that is a calling that you're willing to fight against and try to understand the sources of that social misery at the structural and institutional level and at the existential and the personal level. That's what it means, in part, to be a leftist," close quote. Now, of course, he said in part. But it's interesting that someone could discuss the structural, institutional, existential, and personal levels of the culture of violence and not use words like environment, land base, ecosystem, extinction, or animals. But this isn't too shocking if you're paying attention. After all, on the Left Forum website, if you were looking for this panel, they broke it down into issues. There was no animal rights link on the Left Forum website. It's been a long time that this particular issue is treated on the left as a stepchild of sorts. This gathering is called Rekindling the Radical Imagination. So maybe if we just had a little less Marxist theory and a little bit more direct action, but I digress. This is typical of how animal rights activism is viewed all across the full spectrum, not just the left. Come on in. As I said, this is typical of how animal rights activism is viewed not just by the left, but across the full spectrum. For example, in the right wing or the mainstream, or perhaps I'm being redundant, perhaps anyone who doesn't call themselves a leftist, animal rights activists, vegan activists, dark green eco-activists are universally called terrorists. Which makes me wonder, how exactly does one qualify as a terrorist in 2010 America?
Breathe.
Because by today's standards, you can pack a calf into a veal crate, you can pump food down a goose's gullet, you can blind and dissect a monkey, and you can grind up live male chicks to fertilize your fields, and you'd run no risk of being called a terrorist.
Oh, I've been sitting in the wrong room for 20 minutes.
You could also clear-cut forests, blow off mountaintops in search of coal, and drag trolling nets across the ocean floor. And you would garner virtually no attention at all, let alone be called a terrorist. But if you choose a lifestyle of compassion and logic, you speak out against vivisection, and you protest the use of fur, you, says the mainstream and the right at least, deserve an orange jumpsuit and a one-way ticket to Guantanamo. Literally. Consider the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act of 2006, the AETA, which specifically targets anyone who, quote, intentionally damages or causes the loss of any real or personal property, including animals or records, used by animal enterprise. And then it goes further, or any real or personal property of a person or entity having a connection to, relationship with, or transactions with an animal enterprise. That's a pretty broad brush that it's painting with. Now, when I read this excerpt from the AETA, I can't help myself. As I said earlier, I did 12 years in Catholic school. I like to juxtapose it with this other quote. This one comes from the book of John, chapter 2, verses 13 to 16, which reads as follows. In the temple courts, Jesus found men selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, get out of here. So the next time someone poses that famous question to you, what would Jesus do? Thanks to the AETA, you can now confidently answer 12 to 18 months. Which brings us to the left. So that's the right wing and the mainstream, or like I said, maybe I'm being redundant. Now, the left, when it comes to issues of animal rights activism, vegan activism, and again, dark green eco-activism, for the most part, doesn't get it, or should I say, won't get it. And when I talk about the left, I am casting a very broad net here, because I'm including Al Gore. who by any sane definition is not a leftist. However, in an insane culture, he is viewed as a dangerous socialist by much of the population. He is also viewed, perhaps rightfully so, as the world's most famous environmentalist, maybe even the face of environmentalism on planet Earth. Yet he has spent the bulk of his career ignoring the role of the meat-based diet in climate change. A recent World Watch Institute report found that 51% of human-induced greenhouse gases come from the industrial meat-based diet, the #1 cause of climate change on planet Earth today. The #1 environmentalist ignores it. And I recently interviewed the musician Moby and asked him about it because I know he spoke to him. And he said, I asked Al Gore about it, and he said, believe it or not, he said, it's too inconvenient to ask people to give up meat. They won't do it. Inconvenient. Last month in the New York Times, Al Gore wrote an op-ed 2,000 words long called "We Can't Wish Away Climate Change." And I did a word search over those 2,000 words, and none of the following terms were found: meat, cow, livestock, methane, farm, diet, or vegan. But again, this should not come as a surprise to anyone who's paying attention. This is the man who sponsored the Live Earth concerts nearly 3 years ago. Concerts designed to bring awareness to climate change, concerts at which meat and hamburgers and hot dogs were sold. But what about the more serious left? People who by any definition would qualify as a leftist. For example, let's say Michael Albert, founder of Z Magazine and ZNet website. A man with nearly 5 decades of activist credibility, a long association with Noam Chomsky, which gives him even more credibility, and for the left wing, an extremely large audience through the magazine and through the website. So what is Michael Albert doing with all this credibility and influence and this large audience, often made up of activist college students? Well, here's an excerpt from his memoir. Quote, I see no comparison in importance between seeking to eliminate the roots and branches of sexism and seeking to eliminate the roots and branches of violence against animals. I see no comparison in importance between how chickens are treated and how women or any humans are treated. In fact, for me, the animal rights agenda resonates barely at all, and the anti-sexism agenda is part of my life, close quote. So rather than seeing past his own personal biases and myopia and encouraging a more holistic perspective on radical activism, okay, got to talk faster then, he is instead choosing to legitimize what is essentially single-issueism. So I'm going to pick up the pace here a little bit. Moving a little further to the left, perhaps he would cringe at being called a leftist, we have Ward Churchill, the American Indian scholar and activist, a man of whom I typically write of with admiration, but not when he says stuff like this. For most people in the anarchist community who organize in their little collectives and get together and eat their bean sprouts and shit, it's only for themselves at the present time. If you want to talk to factory workers, you need to get over your prohibition on ashtrays. Get over your bicycles and go down and bend a wrench with a gearhead for a while. Do what he's fucking doing, close quote. So again, he doesn't have as large an audience as Michael Albert, nowhere near Al Gore, but he has an audience, he has influence, and instead of saying, I'm going to go see past, maybe he doesn't agree with the animal rights agenda, he's not encouraging his audience to think larger than he is. In fact, he's promoting a stereotype by saying, do what he's fucking doing, that real men fix cars and smoke cigarettes, while wimps ride bicycles and eat bean sprouts.
That's not true?
So my message to Ward Churchill, Michael Albert, Al Gore, and anyone on the left who chooses to ignore the larger connections here is that with 80% of the world's forests already cut down, 90% of the large fish in the ocean already gone, over 100 plant and animal species going extinct every week, and our ecosystem fast approaching the point of no return, there's never been a more urgent time to be such a wimp. But in the face of a global crisis, the left chooses to ignore our collective soul. Like the bull in a bullfight, it focuses on the elusive red cape instead of the matador, distracted from the real targets by an attractive image or illusion. But fear not, some bulls see through the red cape bullshit and quite justifiably introduce the matador to the business end of their mighty horns. Now, as of now, those bulls are promptly killed while the matador is mourned as a brave hero. But consider this question. If every single bull at every single bullfight were to gore every single matador, how long would it be before bullfights are a thing of the past? Now, I opened up with a quote about souls. I will end with a quote about souls. This one, 45 years old, from Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who said, one day, the absurdity of the almost universal human belief in the slavery of other animals will be palpable. We shall then have discovered our souls and become worthier of sharing this planet with them. Thank you.
Very we go. Our next guest is the organizer of the annual Veggie Pride Parade in New York City. She's the author of the popular 101 Reasons Why I'm a Vegetarian. They're both in book and pamphlet form, and they're available right here today if anyone has any interest. She has kept a vegan advocacy organization, the Viva Veggie Society with one G. It is, Pam, right? And the Veggie Center alive here in New York City since 1999. During the 90s, she published a cutting-edge vegan issues magazine, The Vivifying. It is a true pleasure for me to introduce Pamela Rice.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really, really wonderful to be here. Could somebody shout out the title of this again before me? What's the title of
Species
this?
and
Speciesism, the Forgotten Oppression.
The Forgotten Oppression, Why Should the Left Care?
When I first heard that from Camille, I just had to chuckle. I mean, you know, why should we care? It said, why shouldn't we care? But I guess a lot of people don't care. And so we have to do something about that. We have to instill, I guess, caring, maybe, or we can just get the information out to people. I'm a vegan for 20 years now, and a vegan activist for just about that long as well. So I became a vegan activist the minute I became a vegan, pretty much. I went to a conference, North American Vegetarian Society Summerfest, way back when. They're still doing it, by the way. And I read a book, Diet for a New America, by John Robbins, published 1987. I was blown away. I realized that the meat-centered diet was a catastrophe on many, many levels. And I got home from the conference, I read the book, and I started making a list. Why would a person want to be a vegetarian? And it kept getting longer and longer. And I says, boy, I can make a list, maybe 100 items here. I said, why not make that 101? And I published it, and here's first edition of 101 Reasons. Go back to, this is pre-computer era. In 1991, started passing it out on the street. And it's a succinct little package. You can read it backward to the front. It's soundbite. It's form. It's for people with short attention spans. People can hold in their pocket. It's very convenient. It's basically Cliff Notes for this book, Cliff Notes for that conference I went to. A person can find out everything about why a person would want to become a vegan, vegetarian, pretty quickly with this. It's now 8 editions later. We have over 200,000 copies of it in circulation over the years. I wouldn't have kept doing this if people didn't show that they were quite interested in this information. This information is hidden from people largely. It's not in the mainstream media, much of this information. Although I get most of my facts from the mainstream media, it's very buried, and what this document does is put everything together in a very succinct, easy to use form. Well, let me paraphrase Rin Berry, who is a writer, a treasure in this city. He writes a lot of books, and all on vegan theme. He's been quoted by the New York Times saying all reasons to be vegan, to be vegetarian, are good reasons. All reasons are good reasons. My tactic has always been to just simply give people the facts. And I was raised with a strong moral sense in my family. The minute I found out this information, boom, there's just no way I could take part in this anymore. As for the left, a good tactic would be to, with this issue, is to emphasize the severe inequities that are involved with this issue. I mean, first of all, the rich world we're 5% in this country, 5% of the population. Many people have heard this statistic, but we are using 25% of the natural resources, largely because we're using so much oil. Well, you say, well, okay, we're using a lot of oil with our cars, but really agribusiness is really sucking it up, a lot of the oil. And eating meat really separates the rich from the poor. And it's absolutely amazing, I mean, how much oil is responsible for agribusiness. I mean, it's 100%. A lot of people are saying these days we are at peak oil. I think we're really close. And it will be that when it's over, that agribusiness will be over. And maybe animal rights people will say, well, that's a good thing. Well, we'll also be at the end of oil. And I don't think we appreciate the oil age that we're still in, and that we have oil. We have lights in this room right now. We have our cell phones and all of our electronic devices and our computers and everything we have. Unfortunately, because we're chopping off or we're blowing up the tops of mountains to get coal. Half of our electricity comes from coal. Much of our oil is, we're out of oil in our own country. Now we're going from country to country with wars of aggression to get it. If you want to talk to people on the left wing about that issue and the inequities and how we are basically stealing fossil fuels, which is what it's all about, from other countries, go that route any way you can. When people eat meat, it is like having an extra car in the driveway. That's essentially it. We need to become versed in these issues, in the facts, in this information. If you take anything away from this day, there are no laws to protect animals raised for food. In fact, if you read the Animal Welfare Act, which sounds like a great thing, the Animal Welfare Act is actually there to protect animal industries. It says straight out that this law does not apply to animals raised for food or fiber. And state laws have been dismantled. In case anybody is not familiar with what goes on in factory farms today, what it's all about, I'm going to give just a very quick overview. Animals are indoors now. Most of them, all the pigs are, all the chickens are. Cows are also indoors. When I first heard the cows and the factory farmed animals were indoors, I go, well, that's crazy. You've got all kinds of space outdoors, you know. But they've been brought indoors, thank you, oil age, which is, again, fast coming to a close. Because it's easier to regulate everything about them. You can get them to slaughter weight or whatever weight you need. You can get so many eggs out of them, whatever it is, over a certain period of time. You can regulate everything about them. And the animals are kept in intensive confinement. They live in their own waste. They are fed drugs, pharmaceuticals, and still they die in enormous numbers. In fact, when you eat that piece of animal food on your plate, it's this dead piece of animal food. There's all these other dead animals that you don't see because they are a byproduct of the production process. And if you want to talk about fishing, which Mickey alluded to, we are scouring our oceans right now of all the fish that people like to eat. And there's something called bycatch, whereas about 25% of all the fish that are caught are not used. They're just thrown back dead into the ocean. So there's that. And My 101 Reasons has all kinds of reasons about health and food contamination, many, many environmental reasons, and but if I can just take a few more minutes to mention two technological breakthroughs that have allowed all this to happen, so we can get a perspective on this historically, in geologic time, if you want to look at it that way. Human beings discovered how to make synthetic nitrogen, or extract nitrogen from the air. We can make synthetic nitrogen, and if you think about that, those words are unbelievable. I mean, for all of human history, we did not have enough fertilizer to grow crops. And so we had something called the Green Revolution. In the 60s it started, where we are able to get this cheap, easily obtained nitrogen from the air, and that's fertilize our plants. And then we are also able to dig very deep down with other kinds of technologies to get the water. We're mining our aquifers now for this addiction to animal foods. We can get enormous amounts of plant material, corn and soybeans. We also feed all of this process with lots of, literally billions of dollars in subsidies every year to the people who grow commodity crops, namely corn and soybeans, which feed the animals so we can eat them. We've got the oil age to help us with the tractors, the refrigeration, and these petrochemical fertilizers. These fertilizers are made from fossil fuels. Natural gas is part of the process. So all of these inputs put together allow us to have enormous amounts of feed for the animals. And all of this, my friends, is going to come to an end. Let's think this through and see if we can have a good transition out of the oil age. Let's start going vegan, and that is a huge part of it.
Thank you very much, Pam.